Good afternoon from Tallinn. I am Kadri Kaska, head of the CCDCOE law branch, your moderator for this session. Welcome to CyCon Day 1 and our cyber norms panel. I must admit up front that out of all years to miss CyCon, at least this year I can offer you the cheap consolation of the weather being ridiculously rainy and snowy, well, not snowy, but stormy outside, the yacht-crowded harbor next to us looking rather sad, and the Nordic White House renowned cafes next door being relatively empty. So if you had to miss a year in Tallinn, I'm glad it's this one. So, of course, it's poor solace thinking of it's otherwise every bit as charming spring in Tallinn. The city is finally opening up after months of forced pause. So, and I so wish that we could do CyCon in the mixed, fresh and charming cyber Woodstock that it's loved for and returned to. So, next year, friends. Today, we aim as close as we can with this virtual CyCon, and I am pleased to welcome 4 excellent speakers with each of their unique perspectives to discuss the norms, rules, and principles for the conduct of states, and not just states, but also other actors in cyberspace towards ensuring a stable, safe, and secure cyber environment. So in the order of appearance, a warm welcome to the panelists, Dr. François Delarue, Dr. Jonas Gretz-Hoffmann, Mr. Vladimir Radunovich, and Mr. Raman Jit Singh Chima. So the session will come at Cyberspace with a year and a half of a pandemic behind us. We are more digital than ever on every layer of society. Well, perhaps the military, which is proudly defying change, it seems. But every cyber incident response team, you ask, reports increased levels of low-intensity malicious cyber activities. Now the question is, has the accelerated digitalization and the subsequent realization of our own vulnerability and digital dependency also accelerated the crystallization of cyber norms? And if so, then how? We have 3 different perspectives on the panel today, that of states, that of industry, and of civil society. And before we hand the floor over to the speakers, I'd like to lay out some house rules. So the speakers will present their work for 12 to 15 minutes per paper or intervention, followed by possibly a short question from me. And then we will have a Q&A session towards the end of the session. And to the audience, please don't be shy in using the opportunity to send in your questions to the speakers. We will be very happy to dive into the discussion right after the presentations. So our first speaker is Dr. François Delarue, who will speak of the importance of legal clarity about the rule of sovereignty in an era of the cyber pandemic that has accompanied the COVID pandemic. François Delarue is a research fellow in cyber defense and international law at the French Institute for Strategic Research and a lecturer at Sciences Po Paris. He's also a non-resident associate fellow at the Hague Program for Cyber Norms at Leiden University and a rapporteur for international law to the Academic Advisory Board of the EU Cyber Direct project. And his book titled Cyber Operations and International Law was published by Cambridge University Press in February last year. François' article, COVID-19 and the Cyber Pandemic, a plea for international law and the rule of sovereignty in cyberspace, is published in this year's CyCon proceedings from page 9 onwards, and is a message that needs to be heard loud and clear. And the presentation outgoes from the same article. So François, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kadri. Dear colleagues, it's my pleasure to be here today, even if it's only remotely. And it's the same situation in Paris. We have also a very rainy day, so it's a good thing to be inside rather than being outside. Even if we will enjoy a coffee in Tallinn, that would be nice as well. So my article is titled "COVID-19 and the Cyber Pandemic: A Plea for International Law and the Rule of Sovereignty in Cyberspace." And I would like to thank the organizer for such a great event and for having organized it online due to the situation, as well as for the publication of the proceeding. As you mentioned, I am a researcher at IRSEM, which is a research center of the French Ministry of Defense. So I wanted to make clear that I am talking today in my personal capacity and not in the name of IRSEM or the ministry. The objective of my chapter is to analyze the COVID-19 cyber pandemic through the lens of international law and with a specific focus on the rule of sovereignty in cyberspace. In that sense, one of the main focus of the article, of the chapter, is to assess whether the alleged state-conducted or state-sponsored cyber operation taking place during the pandemic constitute intentionally wrongful acts and more precisely breaches of the rule of sovereignty. Building on this assessment, I am also reflecting on what it can tell us about the framework of responsible state behavior, and in particular on the evolution of the internal law applicable to cyber operations. Let's start with the cyber pandemic. The cyber pandemic takes mainly two forms. On the one hand, we saw cyber threat taking advantage of the pandemic-induced crisis. Indeed, the digitalization of our lives for work, entertainment, but also staying in touch with our friends and family has increased the possible surface of attack. And we have witnesses, for instance, cyber operation targeting video conferencing systems. The second category that we saw, the second form, are cyber threats directed at the healthcare sector and at institutions involved in the management of the crisis. For instance, we saw cyber operation conducted by Dark Hotel or Ocean Lotus against Chinese and international institutions involved in the crisis management. We also witnesses cyber operation against the World Health Organization. It seems that a lot of these cyber operation aimed at gathering information on the spread of the virus, what was the situation, and understand more what was happening. We saw also on that kind of the second stage a new wave of cyber operation targeting institution, research center involved in the vaccine race, and that was also an interesting evolution. What is interesting when we talk about these two categories, and there is also the third category, which I'm not studying in the article, which is the infodemic. On that, there have always been some interesting articles, and I would like to cite the one by Barry Sanders and Nicolas Tsagourias, which was published in the Journal of International Humanitarian Legal Studies. So I will not work on that in this presentation. This is not part of it, and I'm focusing on the cyber operations, the cyber pandemic. What I wanted to say on the two categories is, conversely to the first form, the second category has led to some accusation by states that some other states were responsible for conducting or sponsoring cyber operation directed at healthcare sector and other institutions involved in the crisis management. And that's interesting observation. Then if we move on the question of international law and how the international community has reacted. Indeed, we have witnesses and we saw different initiative and declaration by state to recall the importance of international law and the framework of responsible state behavior to deal with cyber threat, and in particular cyber threat with the pandemic. We had two area formula meetings at the UN Security Council in May and August 2020. We also had unilateral declaration by several states, including and international organizations, including the European Union, in April 2020. However, when we study the concrete example of cyber operations that have been condemned or attributed by state to other states, there is no mention by the attributing states of international law and of which rule of international law has been breached. And that's interesting because we see kind of a discrepancy between the general discourse of state, which are attached to international law as one of the cornerstones for peace and stability of cyberspace, but at the same time, we don't see it translating into their practice on actual cases of cyber operation. Studying the discrepancy between the discourse and the practice is one of the objectives of the paper, which led in the chapter, it's led me to analyze what is how international apply to cyberspace. So I will not detail that here, but states have already declared that they recognize the applicability of international law. It was recognized by the UNGGE in its report in 2013 and then confirmed by most states in their subsequent documents. You had also several initiatives to work on the content of international law. Here I put the Tallinn manuals 1 and 2, which were great initiatives sponsored by the CCDCOE. So that's also a bit of the context of the article. What we have also is we saw in the recent year 2 interesting evolution in state practice related to the international applicable to cyber operation. On the one hand, a growing number of states releasing publicly what is their view on the international applicable to cyberspace. The only thing here is for now, we have only a limited number of states, less than 20, and also most of them are Western states. So that's also a partial geographical picture. The second thing which is interesting is that states are increasingly developing and strengthening their practice in conducting, but also in reacting to cyber operation. But here we can have the same assessment the same observations that I just mentioned is, as it is the case with COVID-related cyber operation in general, including or actual cyber operation, states make no use of international law, nor they explain on which international rule have been breached by the behavior. So one of the objectives, as I say, is to question the reason for that. And in the paper, talking about the world international law, about the world process to apply international, which I have summarized on this flowchart published 2 years ago. But I am focusing on the question on whether or not a cyber operation may constitute an internationally wrongful cyber act, which are conditions it must be attributable to a state. I am not focusing on that, but I'm focusing on the second condition, which is to constitute a breach of an international obligation. And in the chapter, I am diving into the prohibition of the use of force on threat of force, the prohibition of intervention, and the rule of sovereignty. And the conclusion of this study, the conclusion of this assessment is actually that the vast majority of cyber operations and all the examples of cyber operation we have during the COVID-19 pandemic are so far not constituting a use of force or a threat of force. Most don't have aggressive elements that will allow to qualify them as unlawful interventions. But most of them have actually the elements that could make them constituting breaches of sovereignty. Why? Because most of them are penetrating into computer systems of other states with an objective to steal, or at least to access and to steal to data. So it's why in the paper I have this focus on sovereignty, and I have this focus on sovereignty in the conclusion of the paper. When we talk about sovereignty, in international law, the prohibition of the violation of territorial sovereignty in cyberspace. What is interesting is in one of the most, let's say, debated rule or principle of international law, with some state considering that it's only a principle and that the rule is only the rule of unlawful intervention when there is a coercive element. That's the British approach. Other states considering that it's a rule, but then we see three main different approaches, which is for some state penetration-based approach. Any penetration into a computer system could be considered as a violation of sovereignty. That's, for example, the approach that France adopted. We have also other states that decided to adopt what we call a de minimis approach, which is to say that you need to, in addition to the penetration, a certain threshold of harm. It's also the approach that was adopted in the Tallinn manual. And then you have also another approach, which was in the Tallinn manual and which has been adopted by Netherlands, which is to say that there are also cases of interference or usurpation of inherently governmental functions that constitute violation of sovereignty. So what is interesting when you analyze the examples that we have from the COVID-19 pandemic is all of them are penetrating into computer systems. So according to the penetration-based approach, they will constitute violation of sovereignty, but actually most of them may not meet the threshold of arms that is requested. And then most of them may not constitute unlawful attempt to violate sovereignty. And that's an interesting conclusion, which leads me to the conclusion of the paper, which is to say that the assessment of the lawfulness of the cyber operations that take advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic confirms main challenges is not the identification of the relevant norms or the principle of international law, but rather their interpretation and implementation by states. So we have the rules in place, but the question is how states are applying them or interpreting them, which I like the comment that I already made, which is the cyber operation during the COVID-19 pandemic are not really different to what we see outside of the pandemic. But what is different is actually the fact that there is an increase in the number, and also there is an increase in tension over the victim of this cyber operation. And that's a very interesting element. Building on these elements, I am saying that it's highlight two incoherent elements in the approach of some state on the international law applicable to cyber operation, which are also present and highlighted in the context of the cyber pandemic. Firstly, some states have adopted an approach by adding a requirement for a threshold of for a violation of sovereignty, and that's kind of original because we don't see such a requirement in the real world. And at the same time, there is a dilemma existing between peace and stability in cyberspace, through notably the condemnation and attribution of unfriendly and unlawful cyber operation, and the willingness at the other end of state to avoid legal constraint on some activities such as cyber espionage. And using the example of the US practice over SolarWinds, but also the defense forward strategy, I show our state may adopt a different approach from a legal point of view, but also from an acceptability point of view over a similar type of operation, depending on which side the state is placed. Such a situation leads to kind of a blurring of the lines, the legal lines between lawful and unlawful behavior, and contribute to the erosion of the international rule-based order, or at least it's what we may see as a risk with such an approach. And this is the conclusion of the paper, which is also the conclusion of my presentation today. I'm happy to discuss my chapter with you.
For this lucid contextualization of the legal rules we must make work for to tackle the cyber pandemic. I have one quick question for you before we move on to the next presentation. Would you imagine a shift of legal qualification of cyber attacks as the impact of cyber operations increases due to society's drastically grown digital dependency during the pandemic?
Yes, I think that's a very interesting question, and that's one of the elements I want to show in the chapter, with this idea that at the end, the cyber operation we have witnessed are not really different from what we usually see, but the difference is there is a growing intention from state and from the public over the victims, and thus a growing awareness of the risk. And I believe that such a situation may actually incentivize some state maybe, and also international organization, to push for a stricter approach on sovereignty, or maybe a more inclusive approach on sovereignty.
Thanks. This does tempt me to your next question, but I will leave you in suspense. Hopefully we have more time to discuss towards the end of the session. Thank you very much again, Francois. And I'd like to move on to the next presentation, which will be done jointly by 2 of the 3 co-authors of another CyCon proceedings article, which assesses the impact that good corporate practices for digital product security could have on global cyber stability. And Mr. Jonas Kretz-Hoffmann and Mr. Vladimir Radunovich are the 2 of the authors that will be presenting this paper. And I would like to first introduce them both before giving the floor over to them. So Jonas Kretz-Hoffmann is a scientific collaborator at the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland. He contributes to the Federal Department's foreign policy in the areas of cyber diplomacy and digital governance. Prior to this position, he was economic advisor at the OSCE Secretariat in Vienna, and from 2015 to 18, he held different positions at the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, inter alia being the desk for the OSCE's activities in Ukraine. Mr. Kretz has worked in different European think tanks, including the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin, and the Center for Security Studies at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. And he holds a doctorate in political science from Frankfurt University. And Mr. Vladimir Radunovich is a lecturer and director of educational programs in the areas of internet governance, cybersecurity, and e-diplomacy at the Diplo Foundation. He has been a member of the advisory board of the Global Forum of Cyber Expertise and a member of the UN Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group for the Internet Governance Forum. Vladimir graduated from the Faculty of Electrical Engineering in Belgrade and has a master's degree in contemporary diplomacy from the University of Malta, and he is a PhD candidate in cybersecurity. And his professional focus has been on digital policies and diplomacy, in particular cybersecurity, cyber diplomacy, education, and capacity building for institutions and internet decision makers. And their paper is published on page 25 in CyCon proceedings. So Jonas, Vlada, gentlemen, you're very welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kadri, for the kind introduction. I will start off this presentation and then I will hand over to Vladimir. So thanks a lot for the good organization and the introduction. Great to be in Tallinn, if only virtual. It has been a while I've been there physically, but maybe next year. So let me start taking you away a bit from the state perspective that we've just had and look at the private sector. So what is our argument that we are trying to make today? The first point in our argument is that vulnerabilities in digital products are an essential part of many sophisticated cyber attacks, and also not so sophisticated ones that we are seeing today. And those cyber attacks obviously have an impact on global cyber stability. We also look at multilateral norms that have been developed at the UN level, for example, that also identify vulnerabilities in digital products as being the source of insecurities, and also address those vulnerabilities with some prescriptions for states and other actors. And then we are zooming into good corporate practices as one of the cures for these vulnerabilities in digital products. So the argument is like, on the one hand, we have these vulnerabilities that are contributing to cyber attacks. And so we need to work with the private sector to improve the practices for developing and disseminating the products that they are developing, to make them more secure, to reduce the risk of cyber attacks. And then in the end, we will also discuss how to support the wider adoption of those good practices throughout the supply chain worldwide. So let me zoom in now into the argument. What is global cyber stability? We are using partly the definition of the Global Commission on the Stability of the Cyberspace, which takes a pretty broad view and states cyber stability is a situation where the availability and integrity of services in and through cyberspace are generally assured, where change is managed in a relative peace, and where tensions are resolved in a non-escalatory manner. So note that this definition is pretty wide. It is wider than the question of cyber peace or armed conflict or even APT attacks, but looks at the availability, integrity in general of cyberspace. And then looking at the next question, how to reach cyber stability. Can states solve the problem on their own? We just heard from Francois the different views that states hold on sovereignty in cyberspace and how it applies, what constitutes the breach, and so on. And these discussions have been taken place. Obviously, many states are voicing their opinion on this in the papers that they put out, but they have also been discussing this at the UN since 2004, so for almost for 18 years now, almost 20 years now. So what we have seen so far was the adoption of 11 voluntary norms of responsible state behavior that have been set out in the report of the 2013 to 15 UN Group of Governmental Experts on Cyber ICT Security. And these norms have been further strengthened by the report of the first open-ended working group under the UN General Assembly that it was agreed upon this March. And in this report, we also see that states have underscored the value of further strengthening collaboration with other actors such as civil society, the private sector, academia, and the technical community. And also, if we look at what states do below the international level, we recognize that regulation and standardization in the area of cybersecurity is still very nascent and uneven, and has also difficulty coping with rapid technological change, and also has the problem that if you put up new barriers, new regulations, then the products will be more expensive, and this also is a disincentive to kind of go further with regard to digital standardization and regulation. So there's now a broad recognition that states cannot ensure the stability of cyberspace without collaboration with other stakeholders. The private sector is clearly the most important because digital products are being developed, maintained, and secured by this private sector and the technical community. So let's look a bit closer at the norms that I just outlined. They also contain proposals that would need collaboration with the private sector in their realization, such as the norm to protect the integrity of the supply chain so that end users can have confidence in the security of ICT products, or to encourage the responsible reporting of vulnerabilities. That's also something that states have to do in unison or in collaboration with the private sector. Even as those norms do not directly encourage development of secure products, it is reasonable to assume that the integrity of the supply chain also encompasses digital products, because if you look at the formulation that end users can have confidence in the security of ICT products, the product dimension is clearly addressed here. So then we also have the GCSC I mentioned at the beginning, the Global Commission. They also take a multi-stakeholder view and echo some of these norms that have been developed at the UN level. The Paris Call is, of course, a multi-stakeholder initiative, has also a principle on security, principle number 6, and the Charter of Trust, which is an industry initiative, also looks at this naturally. So in our paper, we take a multi-stakeholder approach or perspective on global cyber stability. We argue specifically that cyber stability can be enhanced if the private sector is assisting in implementation of these above-mentioned norms by improving the security of the digital products. So why do we look specifically at these corporate practices for digital products? Let me highlight also in the COVID-19 pandemic, and we heard about the cyber pandemic and so on before. Ransomware incidents and even APT incidents have been on the rise, and they often leverage insecurities in digital products. Let me give you just 3 examples. Most recently, the Colonial Pipeline ransomware incident. We do not yet know the exact attack vector, but the threat actor that has been identified to be behind this attack has exploited the vulnerability in SonicWall firewalls in the past. Then secondly, the SolarWinds hack that created a backdoor to about 18,000 entities, including the US government and research facilities, via the update process of this software. Here, attackers gained initial access via an insecure password, which could have been prevented using security by design practices. And also, conversely, the breach was detected only by very well-maintained practices of two-factor authentication, because when it was detected by FireEye only when an employee apparently wanted to register a second phone for two-factor authentication, and then they were made aware of this attack. So this shows that also good practices can help detecting attacks, and that attacks can be prevented by better practices. Another well-known incident are the 4 zero-day exploit in Microsoft Exchange Server this year. Those have been used very widely also after the patches had been issued by Microsoft as part of the vulnerability management process. As many smaller organizations or even bigger ones have difficulties in patching in a timely manner. So this also shows that it's important to upfront secure digital products and not only patch them afterwards. So from these examples, it's clear that if digital products are being developed in a more secure way, it will be more difficult to conduct such attacks. Vlada will now take you further into the practices that we developed as part of the Geneva dialogue, and I hand it over to him. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonas, and thank you, Kadri, for the invitation. It's pity that our third author, Marile, is not here, because we would strike a little bit of a gender balance, but that means that there are ladies which are involved in this research as well. One of the main goals of our paper is, as Jonas said, was basically to connect the aspects of vulnerabilities and security of products with cyber stability, because our impression is that it's not so often done. For instance, it's often discussed separately within the norms focus. There is not enough focus on vulnerability and exploiting vulnerabilities and basically keeping the whole cyberspace less vulnerable. And at the same time, in the business communities, there is a lack of broader understanding of how vulnerabilities impact stability. It's not just about their reputation and accountability. It's a much bigger stake. And if we look at various type of attacks, the vulnerabilities play an important role also in these models about sophisticated attacks, such as the meter attack or the kill chain and so on by Lockheed Martin. There are a number of papers as well within the GCSC briefings also, which connect the offensive cyber capabilities to exploiting vulnerabilities. So basically, the goal is reducing vulnerabilities can lead to increasing costs of conducting attacks, which in turn can certainly impact stability, and we need products which are more secure. Now, moving on to good practices, and this whole research is being developed within the context of the Geneva Dialogue on Responsible Behaviour, which is basically sort of an initiative by Diplo Foundation and the FDFA, with particular participation of the private sector, and that's where we come back to the positions and roles of private sector. I'll just name a couple of them which are well known. They include ABB, Bison, which is part of Sber, Cisco, FireEye, Mandiant, Huawei, Kaspersky, Microsoft, NCR, Siemens, Tata Consultancy, UBS. So companies are really around the world which were involved in discussions about their good practices. And these discussions in the last year and a half now revolved around security by design, or how do we embed security from the beginning of planning of a digital product, and what are some of the good practices that stand out. The report by the Geneva Dialogue of last year outlines 5 general chunks of good practices, which includes threat modeling, supply chain and third-party security, particularly knowing what's in your product. And what's now becoming a buzzword is bill of material and software bill of material. We see that in the executive order by the US as well these days. Then secure development and deployment, including securing the aspects of developing the code and pushing the updates, which is exactly what was the problem in SolarWinds. Then the vulnerability processes, vulnerability management, vulnerability disclosure, which doesn't limit only to companies. It also involves the mediators, the certs, the government, the regulatory environment, and so on. And then adjusting the mindsets, which means involving the C-level of the companies, working across departments, and so on. But then I won't go into details. We can certainly get back to these more technical details if there is interest. But then the question is, how do we move towards a greater implementation of these, let's say, good practices, and how do we connect the dots, basically? And there are a couple of features that impact this environment. One is the complexity of supply chain. We have more and more open source code, the third-party components. There is a lack of understanding of this bill of material, of understanding what is in a particular product, even by vendors. Then the national security considerations, where security is becoming, cybersecurity is becoming a political issue, part of regulatory environment, laws. Then the new critical actors, particularly during the COVID crisis, where we have actors like Zoom, if you wish, and others, which suddenly become sort of a critical part of the supply chain. And again, the US Executive Order recently mentions the critical software. What is a critical software? So there are new players on the board. How do we involve them? And what we outlined was the four major blocks that we have to take into consideration. Corporate practices certainly as being maybe the fastest ones, but then they're based on standards, which are maybe not fast enough now anymore, or not overarching. Regulatory environment, which is popping up, and it's not always in sync with standards and with other developments. We see it in Singapore, in European Union, in Finland, other places. Norms and principles which we mentioned. So the open question, one of the open questions is, how do we connect these dots? How do we put them in sync? And then whether we need some sort of a baseline security requirements that we would all agree upon, which might come out of the good practices. They have to be in sync with the standards. They have to also help standards to be developed. But they might be even playing a role of light standards to help those that can't follow standards, but they are critical as SMEs, as open source communities, as startups which are developing pieces of code and products to catch up and then boost the security of their products. So that's an open question. And just to conclude with maybe a quick summary of what are the takeaways. So enhancing the security of digital products basically can increase the cost of cyber attacks. We need private sector to help implementing this boosting of security of products and thus the norms as well. And certainly Geneva Dialogue has put up some good practices, but we continue discussing this triangle or four components and how to sync them better together. But I invite you to visit the website and happy to discuss more. Back to you, Kadri. Thank you.
Thank you, Vlada. Thanks, Jonas. Thanks to both of you for this convincing case of the private sector's role, not just towards enhancing product cybersecurity or service security, but towards sustaining and promoting global cyber stability, which of course is a topic that the last year has put into a lot more urgency. I was going to ask a quick question, realizing it's not really a quick question, but in any case. In contrast to states who seem to be dragging their feet somewhat when it comes to commitments, there's been private sector induced and initiated initiatives to raise the security of the digital ecosystem, protecting users, empowering product and service providers, refusing from undermining security under government pressure, for example. To which now triple number of digital companies, including global vendors and online platforms, have signed up to. So you described the Geneva Dialogue, which translates high-level abstract principles into day-to-day operations. And admittedly, their initiative has recently concluded and that there's not yet a whole lot of practice to speak of. But do you see this Geneva Dialogue initiative faring better in terms of actual commitments than the UN norms of responsible state behavior? where there's obviously a lot of talk of how an ideal world should look like, but rather little commitment by states to actually follow those rules by themselves rather than expecting that everybody else should play by the rules.
Yeah, thank you, Kadri. Thanks for this question, which just really sums up nicely also our intention with the Geneva Dialogue. Well, I have to say we are part of. We see this as part of the efforts that states are undertaking to enhance cyber stability. And yes, there are a number of initiatives around by the private sector, but they have to be, I think, and we think they have to be more inclusive, reflecting private sector actors from all around the world. That's what we're trying to do. And talking about the implementation, yes, that's something we try to achieve step by step. And that's the practical approach that we are trying to push forward with the Geneva Dialogue. And as Vlada said, this year we are working further, not only on good practices, but also on some baseline recommendations that then could be applied further down the road. And this would be promising because, as I said in the beginning, the private sector really has the boots on the ground, if you wish, to make change happen. Whereas states, of course, they are setting the overall regulatory boundaries, and they are really powerful actors if they want to, but they are not developing digital products by themselves mostly.
Yep. Thank you, and thanks again for the excellent presentation. I see some questions coming from the audience. We are trying to leave some space towards the end for discussion also. So next up, we will have Mr. Ramanjit Singh Chima, who represents the perspective that I'm really glad to have included in this year's CyCon, namely one from the civil society. And he will be laying out the progress of human-centric and user-centric approaches to cybersecurity in both international norm discussion and domestic cybersecurity policy approaches. And to introduce him, Mr. Singh Chima serves as the Senior International Counsel and Asia Pacific Policy Director at Access Now, which is an international non-profit organization set up with a mission to defend and extend the digital civil rights of people around the world. He coordinates the organization's work on cybersecurity policy as global cybersecurity lead. He was among the founders of India's foremost campaign for net neutrality and co-founded the Internet Freedom Foundation in his native India, and currently chairs its board of trustees. Interestingly also, he assisted the legal team involved in the Supreme Court of India's landmark judgment on internet free speech. And he has previously worked in industry, serving with Google's Asia Pacific policy team as policy counsel and government affairs manager. And in 2019, he was awarded a Chevening Cybersecurity Fellowship and completed a program of study at the Defense Academy of the United Kingdom. He's a graduate of National Law School of India University at Bangalore, where he was chief editor of the Indian Journal of Law and Technology. So please, Raman, I'm very glad to welcome you at this CyCon virtual stage.
Thank you so much, Kadri. It's been a pleasure to be here and to be able to follow an excellent series of interventions by many speakers who touched upon many of the points I hope to cover. But I want to go back a bit to the beginning of what you mentioned in terms of the digitalization of society and the importance it lays to cybersecurity. And that, in effect, is also why my organization works in this area. We were born as an organization, and we originally characterized ourselves as a digital rights organization, as you described it. And we now describe ourselves as a human rights organization in the digital age, recognizing that digital touches every part of our societies and polities globally. And what has happened is that, in fact, these issues that we deal with are no longer just digital rights issues. They're human rights issues, and therefore cybersecurity touches upon nearly every major element of social, industrial, as well as political policy conversations. Our birth actually is an organization, and why I often joke and say is that I get to build on the hard work of many others here, is that we were actually born as a digital security organization, a service provider in this space trying to assist civil society groups, journalists, activists, whistleblowers, democratic campaigners in their security needs as they try to organize. A recognition that the internet empowers and enables people, but it's also a source of harm, a source of threat vectors, and a source of sometimes vulnerability and weakness to what they may be doing. But it shapes everything that they do. So, in fact, the real core of the organization and the sort of work that I do in the public policy team actually builds on our digital security helpline, which is a 24/7 helpline maintained by the organization featuring incident handlers, security trainers, security analysts, whose job it is to help journalists, activists, whistleblowers, and others globally, users at risk and vulnerable communities, where they belong to LGBTQI communities or targeted, vulnerable, and ethnically targeted communities in many parts of the world with their digital security needs. And what we see there is an increase significantly in the sorts of security needs that they're facing. And that shapes a little bit of what we do in our public policy work. Access Now, our helpline, along with many other organizations in this space, some of you may know them, of course, Citizen Lab, but many others as well, Amnesty Tech and others, help form and coordinate the Civil Society Computer Emergency Response Team, CiviCert. And our organization is also now a member of the Forum for Incident Response First. And the reason we are there is because we see this issue about the use of digital technologies by civil society, by civic space, as forming critical infrastructure for modern democracies. And if you don't protect this infrastructure, you're actually not protecting a critical part of what we need to safeguard globally. Our helpline has seen a significant increase in the number of requests during the pandemic. And it's shown us also what's happened in terms of digital becoming important and pervasive to what everyone does. So what people are doing offline or in a partially digital way is being done in a much more digitally connected way over 2020 to 2021. By way of example, just in April and March, we saw 180 requests to our helpline, followed by then 195 requests. Significant increases month by month. In fact, every month sees our helpline receive more requests and more asked there. And a significant number of the sort of requests we receive are reactionary. It's people coming under threat or harm and trying to see how they can be helped. 73% of the cases we saw in 2020 were reactionary incident response requests, with most of our requests being to help people with account compromise, but also a significant number of requests from society being around censorship in terms of removed content on social media and trying to see how they could address this. We also saw nearly 180 incidents of harassment against human rights defenders using cyber means in 2020. 26% of our cases have been preventive, which is that civil society and democratic communities are starting to see how can they proactively defend themselves, but it's still a tiny portion of what we're seeing, and rather the majority of what we're getting is a request to immediately help people at need. Why I also mention this is that a lot of things that don't seem connected to cyber or cybersecurity play a role in this. For example, one of the questions we've gotten recently that I thought I'd share here as well is internet shutdowns have a cybersecurity impact. When internet shutdowns have been ordered, including the continuation of shutdowns ordered by some government agencies in parts of the world during the pandemic, is resulted in security updates not being rolled out to devices, people not being able to access security expertise or incident handling resources. And what that has resulted in many people in the most vulnerable, tricky, and sometimes ethnically tense or otherwise disturbed communities or regions in the world not be able to receive the digital security assistance they need. We are seeing an increasing sophistication in attacks against civil society and an overall increase, as I noted, during the pandemic. And that's one reason why we take part in cybersecurity policy discussions. Our focus is to ensure and advance an approach to cybersecurity policy proposals at the national level or international norms that are user-centric, systemic, and products of plural, inclusive, democratic processes. And I think that's why the session topic is something that really interested me. Are we seeing parallel or convergent perspectives? And ironically, we're seeing a mix of both. What we're seeing is a recognition for us and that internationally protected human rights are complementary to cybersecurity. They are not opposed to it. Sometimes we see the human rights communities and the cybersecurity or national security communities see each other in tension. And we actually believe that is not just a lost opportunity, that makes for bad policy. Good human rights respecting approaches in cybersecurity improve cybersecurity as a whole, reducing mistrust, helping encourage actual communication, but also recognizing, as I mentioned, that civil society and other groups are stakeholders in cybersecurity. They are users of it, they are providers of it, and they're therefore important stakeholders in it. We also, therefore, unfortunately, also need to recognize that cyber proposals and cybersecurity policy recommendations sometimes also harm wider societal interests or don't take them into account well. The Freedom Online Coalition, its statement in February 2020, was a useful reminder of this, where they noted that cybersecurity laws, cybercrime laws at the national level, but also global and regional discussions around cyber policy sometimes pose a threat to human rights or are used as excuses to attack human rights. And that is something that states need to push back on. And I think we've seen a lot of that sort of realization over large parts of 2020, 2021. Some moderate successes, some promising opportunities for the future, but a lot of ground to cover. We have seen, as you've seen, some moderate success in global cyber norms conversations, including at the UN. And for example, we actually think that the UN processes are very important. It's very also important to not depend solely on them, to have multiple diverse and perhaps UN plus processes, such as, for example, the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, the Paris Call on Trust and Security in Cyberspace, and many others. But the UN process is also critical because it is the one multilateral place that all states look to or take part in, even if they don't always agree. And a backsliding in the UN processes is very, very harmful. I think all of us saw the disagreements in the previous GGE and a sort of understanding that it didn't really achieve its outcome as being extremely problematic and resulting in greater norm conflict or diffusion globally. That's why the recognition of this OEWG report in preventing that backsliding is very useful, even though its result was far less ambitious than what even we hoped for. In particular, I think that there was a couple of lost opportunities there. We could have seen better progress on simple, practical, technical approaches, such as, for example, vulnerability disclosure, to sort of technical mechanisms of disclosing how vulnerabilities are taking place, ways for states or other actors to report them, and having those processes connected to a multilateral forum like the UN and elsewhere. We also believe that there can be more done in recognizing the role of non-state actors in sometimes being threat actors to cybersecurity. There was recognition of that in some of the OEWG's earlier text versions, not carried forward fully in the final report, although noted in the chair statement. But then there are complementary UN processes that might be helpful. For example, the working group on mercenaries in the OHCHR process and looking at the role of cyber mercenaries may be a place to take strong positions against spyware and surveillance tech vendors who are sometimes resulting in a decrease in global cybersecurity. We also believe that it's important to recognize that there will be tension between states, industry, and civil society. A lot of these discussions in the UN OEWG was about civil society participation, but what really struck me was a comment made by a senior official involved in the process. I respect confidentiality and I won't name them. But what they said was to civil society is, yes, you are trying to get into the room, but when you're in the room out speaking, don't hold back. Your job is to hold us to account, to hold others to account, and to speak truth to power. That sort of commentary is required because while a lot of the UN discussions are about diplomacy and states agreeing, there's also a degree to which you need to push them. Even states who agree on better coordinated cyber norms are conducting practices domestically or bilaterally, which may be problematic. That sort of tension we have seen in the national security and surveillance and vulnerability stockpiling space versus, say, for example, effective cybersecurity connections. The other thing that struck me taking part in these processes, and then many others noted, was the disconnect between what's said in UN meetings, whether in New York, Geneva, or in the future in Vienna, and what happens with national capitals or what happens in security researchers on the ground. Far too often, states say they want to see more coordination on cybersecurity, expertise sharing, and norm agreement globally. But then national cybercrime laws still criminalize security research, still provide gray areas that prosecutors sometimes out of misguided intentions and sometimes, unfortunately, due to desires to suppress criticism of government practices or on preventing cybersecurity disclosures, criminalize what cybersecurity researchers do. And therefore, we undermine the larger cybersecurity community that we all need to depend on. The last thing I'd leave is also the context of national cybercrime laws. And I think that's critical as we see the UN's cybercrime treaty process kick off with the ad hoc working group there. And we've recognized that there is a tension there between national and international cybercrime discussions, data disclosures, and protecting human rights. And I think that's something we should just take into account. I'm just reflecting on the fact that yesterday we saw a ruling from the European Court of Human Rights touching upon some of these issues. And as we see the formalization of the second optional protocol under the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, and you see future discussions in the UN cybercrime process, we need to make sure that we don't go into discussions that undermine trust, that set up conflict. if international cybercrime harmonization proposals are at the risk of human rights, particularly about criminalizing legitimate speech or harming privacy, we are setting them up to fail. We are allowing states to disagree with each other, to set up geopolitical conflict, but to also set up legal and non-conflict at the domestic level. And therefore, we need to not just involve society and other actors there, but we need to look at these sort of complementarities between the human rights system in the UN, the international peace and security discussions, and what technical communities are seeing on cybersecurity. I wanted to therefore chart out these sort of complementarities, divergent processes. So I would say it's sometimes like a line, sometimes running parallel, sometimes intersecting with each other, sometimes very close to each other, but recognizing that we're not always there yet. And therefore, what I do look forward to is discussions in this session, questioning and challenging this. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Raman. Thanks for this this overview of your sort of the end user rights and the human-centric approach that you also stood for in the UN open-ended working group processes. We have rather few minutes left. I would like to ask you one question to sort of follow up on your presentation, and then we still have an outstanding question to Vladimir and Jonas. So, Raman, Access Now forcefully promoted a human-centric approach in global cybersecurity discussion. You obviously closely followed the UN open-ended working group process, and you stood for highlighting the right to privacy and data protection and right to information. And most interesting for me, actually, for practical technical means for accessible for improving cybersecurity. How much do you think that such venues, such as the UN norms groups, can push for the culture change needed to make cybersecurity more end-user accessible?
I think we're seeing slow but positive progress. The fact that a human-centric approach was recognized in the OEWG's final report, despite, and I would note, opposition from some states initially, disagreement, skepticism on what it meant, is a tremendously positive thing. It allows us to now shape what will come next there. It's also, in effect, a repudiation of the sort of idea that cybersecurity is a purely either diplomatic norm-setting conversation or something that is only very technical, looking at large systems. And I think what we need to see next in the new OEWG, but also in the Vienna processes with the UN ad hoc group on cybercrime, is a recognition that a human-centric approach requires looking at whether norms and principles protect the individual users involved in these processes and better secures them. Are you protecting the individuals and the humans involved in cybersecurity, security researchers and the wider security research community? And are you providing them effective remedy, involvement, and accountability in these processes? But it's still a challenge, but we've seen some initial progress, and I've been accused of being an optimist, and I think I probably still am in 2021.
Thank you. It's an optimistic note to conclude that presentation. And Vlad and Jonas, I will ask for your quick comments on the software vulnerabilities. What incentives, what ideas, what mechanisms could there be to convince states to not stockpile and use 0 days? Do you have any ideas how to achieve that? Is the final question. And I realize a minute is very short time, but try your shot.
I may try to briefly respond. On one hand, how to incentivize even the producers, which is a big thing, because the whole industry has shifted from companies. And Raman just reminded me that the digital products are not anymore produced by companies only. It's the civil society organizations which are putting up their own software. It's the governments. It's everyone is doing that. So the whole complexity adds to that. And that adds to the complexity of the effects of a possible attack or misuse of vulnerabilities. And my general comment or regret with the last open-ended working group final report, which was good, was that this exploitation of vulnerabilities and this stockpiling was not more prominently underlined as a real threat, even if not as part of the norms. Don't stockpile. But at least within the threats part, this is one of the critical components of stability of cyberspace. I'm not sure how to push governments for that. I'm quite skeptical that we can, but maybe pushing them towards more transparency, such as vulnerability equity processes, that we know what type of vulnerabilities they stockpile, when and how they use, in what cases, and so on. Maybe transparency can at least help a little bit. I don't know, Jonas, if you have other view.
No, thank you. I think that summarizes it really well. And also Raman's comment about the OEWG with regard to vulnerability disclosure. Yes, that's one way of also showing more responsibility of all stakeholders in disclosing, timely disclosure of vulnerabilities. Yeah, but I cannot add really anything substantial to what Vlada said. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's been a discussion that we could easily continue for at least a half an hour. I very much appreciate all of your rather practical takes to the subject that is inevitably rather abstract. So with that, I would like to thank all of you for your presentations, for sharing your insight and thoughts. And thank you to the audience for listening. CyCon will continue, so I hope to see you around. Thanks very much again.